James Mitchell stood at the edge of Hyde Park, his weathered hands trembling as he clutched the small wooden box. Inside lay his military cross, the bronze medal that had once meant everything to him. The autumn wind cut through his worn coat, but the cold he felt came from somewhere much deeper than the London air. 58 years old, James had spent the last 20 years trying to forget Afghanistan. The nightmares still came, painting his sleep with images of sand, blood, and the faces of friends who never made it home. He had served with honor, they told him. He had saved lives, they said. But all James could remember were the lives he couldn't save. The medal had been presented to him in a ceremony full of pomp and pride. His wife Sarah had cried tears of joy. His children had beamed with admiration, and the newspapers had called him a hero. But heroes weren't supposed to wake up screaming. Heroes weren't supposed to jump at car backfires or avoid crowded places because they reminded them of marketplaces where bombs exploded without warning. Sarah had tried to understand. For 15 years she had held him through the panic attacks, made excuses when he couldn't attend family gatherings, and watched helplessly as the man she married disappeared behind a wall of guilt and trauma. But last month she had finally reached her breaking point. "I can't do this anymore, James," she had whispered through her tears. "I've lost you already. The war took you away from us and you never really came back." The divorce papers had arrived yesterday. Sarah was taking the children to her mother's house in Scotland. She had left the military cross on the kitchen table with a note that simply read, "Maybe it's time to let go of what's destroying you." James had stared at that medal for hours. This small piece of bronze had cost him everything. It represented a moment of bravery that had haunted him ever since. During a Taliban ambush, he had run into enemy fire to pull 3 wounded soldiers to safety. The military called it heroic. James called it surviving while better men died. Now as he walked toward Buckingham Palace, he felt something building inside him. Not the usual numbness that had become his constant companion, but a burning anger. Anger at a system that sent young men to war and then forgot about them when they came home broken. Anger at politicians who spoke of honor, while veterans slept on park benches. Anger at himself for believing that a piece of metal could somehow make sense of senseless violence. The palace gates came into view, and James noticed the crowd gathering for the changing of the guard. Tourists with cameras, families with excited children, everyone eager to witness the ceremony that embodied British tradition and military pride. The very sight of the red uniforms and tall bearskin hats made his stomach clench. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the annoyed looks and muttered complaints. His destination was clear, the ornate gates where hundreds of people pressed against the barriers hoping for a glimpse of royal pageantry. This seemed like the perfect place to make his statement. The guards stood motionless in their sentry boxes, their faces hidden beneath the shadow of their ceremonial hats. They represented everything James had once believed in: duty, honor, service to crown and country. But where had that duty led him? What had his service cost him? James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wooden box. His hands were steadier now, filled with purpose for the first time in months. He had rehearsed what he would say, though he doubted anyone would understand. This wasn't about disrespecting his fellow soldiers or the military. This was about rejecting a system that created heroes out of trauma and expected gratitude for destruction. A family beside him was taking selfies, their teenage daughter posing with the palace in the background. Children ran between their parents' legs, waving small British flags. An elderly couple shared a thermos of tea, the woman pointing excitedly at the approaching guards. Life, normal and oblivious, continued around him. The irony wasn't lost on James. Here he stood, preparing to reject the symbol of his military service, surrounded by people celebrating the very institution that had broken him. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps his message needed to be delivered exactly here, in this place where military tradition was turned into tourist spectacle. He thought of his children, Emma and David, now 12 and 14. Would they understand someday why their father had to do this? Would they realize that love sometimes meant rejecting the things that others expected you to cherish? Sarah had accused him of loving his guilt more than his family. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was his way of finally choosing them over the ghosts that had claimed him. The crowd around him grew thicker as the ceremony approached. James closed his eyes and felt the weight of the medal in his hands. 20 years of nightmares, 20 years of feeling like a fraud, 20 years of trying to live up to a moment of terror that others called heroic. It was time to let it go. When he opened his eyes, he saw one of the royal guards watching him. Even from this distance, James could sense the soldier's attention, though the man's face remained impassive beneath his ceremonial hat. For a moment, James wondered what that guard had seen in his own service. Did he carry his own ghosts? Did he understand what it meant to serve a country that asked everything and gave little in return? The moment had come. James stepped closer to the gate, raised the wooden box above his head, and prepared to speak the words that had been burning inside him for 20 years. He had no idea that his action would spark a reaction that would change both their lives forever. Guard Thomas Wright had been standing at attention for nearly an hour, but his eyes had been tracking the agitated man in the worn coat for the last 10 minutes. 24 years of military service had taught him to read people, and everything about this stranger screamed danger. Not the kind of danger that required immediate action, but something deeper, more desperate. Thomas had seen that look before. In the mirror, actually. During the dark months after he returned from his own deployment in Iraq, the hollow eyes, the barely controlled trembling, the way the man held himself as if carrying an invisible weight. Thomas recognized a fellow soldier even before he noticed how the stranger moved through the crowd, with military precision despite his obvious distress. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and tourists pressed closer to the gates, their excited chatter filling the air. Thomas had performed this ritual thousands of times, but today felt different. The man with the haunted eyes was moving closer, and Thomas could see he was carrying something in a small wooden box. When the stranger stepped forward and raised the box above his head, Thomas knew exactly what was coming. The man's voice, when it finally came, cut through the crowd noise like a blade. "This medal means nothing," James shouted, his words carrying across the courtyard. "They give you bronze for surviving hell, and then they forget you exist." The crowd fell silent, confused and uncomfortable. Parents pulled their children closer. Tourists lowered their cameras, and other guards maintained their stoic poses while scanning for potential threats. But Thomas saw something else in the man's face. Not madness, not violence, just profound exhaustion. James opened the wooden box with shaking fingers, revealing the military cross nestled in faded velvet. The bronze gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and Thomas could make out the distinctive ribbon even from his position. He had seen too many of these medals, usually pinned to the chests of men who looked just as broken as this stranger. "I saved 3 men in Afghanistan," James continued, his voice cracking. 3 men who went home to their families while better soldiers died in that desert. And for what? For this piece of metal that destroyed my marriage and haunts my dreams. Thomas felt something stir inside his chest. His own service medal was locked away in a drawer at home, hidden beneath old photographs and forgotten letters. He had never been able to look at it without remembering the explosion that killed his best friend, Corporal Danny Mills. Thomas had been standing 3 feet away when the IED detonated. 3 feet. The difference between life and death, between going home and becoming a memory. The crowd was growing restless. Some tourists were taking pictures of the disturbed veteran, treating his breakdown like part of the show. Thomas could see security personnel beginning to move through the crowd, their hands resting on their radios. In moments, they would intervene, and this man's desperate attempt to be heard would become just another incident report. James raised the medal high above his head, his face contorted with 20 years of suppressed anguish. "You want to know what heroism looks like? It looks like my wife serving me divorce papers because I can't sleep without screaming. It looks like my children afraid to hug me because I might have a panic attack. This is what your medals cost." Thomas made a decision that would have horrified his commanding officers. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he stepped forward, not enough to break formation completely, but enough to draw closer to the distressed veteran. His movement was so subtle that most observers missed it, but James noticed. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Thomas saw recognition flash in the older man's face. Soldier to soldier, survivor to survivor, they understood each other in a way that civilians never could. Thomas had spent 3 years perfecting the art of standing perfectly still, but now he allowed the slightest nod of acknowledgement to cross his features. "I know you can hear me," James said, his voice dropping to a more conversational level as he focused on Thomas. "I can see it in your eyes. You've been where I've been. You know what it's like to come home from hell and pretend you're grateful for the experience." Thomas did know. He knew about the nightmares that turned sleep into another battlefield. He knew about the way sudden noises could send your heart racing and your mind spiraling back to moments of terror. He knew about the weight of survivor's guilt and the impossible burden of being called a hero when you felt like a fraud. The security team was getting closer, but something in Thomas's subtle shift had communicated itself to the other guards. They remained at attention, but there was a tension in their formation, a sense that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple disturbance. James's hand tightened around the medal. They pin these things on your chest and expect you to be proud, but every time I look at it, I see the faces of the men who didn't make it home. I see Ahmed, the translator who helped us for 3 years before a sniper put a bullet through his head. I see Private Collins, 19 years old, who stepped on a mine because I told him to take point. Thomas felt his own composure beginning to crack. He thought of Danny Mills, who had been planning to propose to his girlfriend when they got back to England. He thought of the letter Danny had written to his parents, the one Thomas had been asked to deliver because he was Danny's best friend. He thought of the weight of that unopened envelope and how it had felt heavier than any military equipment he had ever carried. The crowd was murmuring now, some people beginning to understand that they were witnessing genuine trauma rather than a performance. A few tourists put away their cameras, suddenly aware that documenting this man's breakdown was inappropriate. Children asked their parents quiet questions that received hushed, inadequate answers. You know what the real tragedy is? James continued, still focused on Thomas. It's not that we went to war. Soldiers have always gone to war. The tragedy is that we came home and nobody knew how to help us carry what we brought back. They gave us parades and medals and expected us to be fine. But you can't pin bronze on a broken soul and call it fixed. Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The urge to speak, to break his silence, and acknowledge this man's pain. He had stood guard over the symbols of British military tradition for years, representing the glory and honor of service. But what about the cost? What about the men and women who gave everything and received little more than a pat on the back and a medal they couldn't bear to look at? James raised the military cross one final time, and Thomas knew what was coming next. The question was whether he would stand by and watch, maintaining his professional distance and ceremonial composure, or whether he would do something that could end his career, but might save a fellow soldier's life. The moment hung in the air like smoke from a distant explosion, heavy with possibility, and pregnant with consequences that neither man could fully comprehend. James drew his arm back, preparing to hurl the military cross through the palace gates. 20 years of anguish compressed into this single moment, this final rejection of everything that had destroyed his life. The bronze medal caught the sunlight one last time as he prepared to let it fly. But then something extraordinary happened. Guard Thomas Wright stepped completely out of formation. The crowd gasped audibly. Even people unfamiliar with royal protocol understood that this was unprecedented. The Queen's guards were famous for their unwavering discipline, their ability to remain motionless despite any distraction. They were living statues, symbols of British military precision. But Thomas was walking forward, his ceremonial rifle still at attention, his face grave beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. "Wait," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent courtyard. His words seemed to freeze James in place, the medal still raised above his head but no longer moving toward release. Other guards maintained their positions, but Thomas could feel their attention, their shock at his unprecedented breach of protocol. Tourists began pulling out cameras again, but this time with a sense that they were witnessing history rather than merely documenting someone else's breakdown. Thomas stopped just short of the barrier that separated the guards from the public. He was close enough now that James could see his eyes clearly, could read the understanding and pain that mirrored his own. They were perhaps 10 feet apart, but the distance between them felt both vast and non-existent. "I know what you're carrying," Thomas said, his voice steady but not loud. "I can see it in the way you stand, in the way you hold that medal like it's burning your hands. You're not just carrying bronze, are you? You're carrying them." James felt his arm lower slightly. "You don't understand." "Nobody understands." "Corporal Danny Mills," Thomas replied, 22 years old, from Manchester. He was going to marry a girl named Lisa when we got back from Iraq. He had her picture in his helmet, right next to a 4-leaf clover his grandmother gave him for luck. The clover didn't work. The simple honesty of Thomas's words hit James like a physical blow. Here was someone who truly understood, someone who carried his own ghosts with the same desperate weight. I was standing 3 feet away when the bomb went off. Thomas continued. 3 feet. I used to lie awake calculating those 3 feet over and over, wondering what I could have done differently, why it was him and not me. They gave me a medal too, called me brave for pulling his body out of that wreckage, but brave men don't spend 5 years afraid to sleep without lights on. James's hand was shaking so violently now that the metal box rattled. How do you stand there every day? How do you wear that uniform and pretend it means something good? Thomas was quiet for a moment, and James could see him struggling with something. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more personal, because someone has to remember them properly. Not as heroes in some story, but as real people who deserve to come home. Danny wasn't a hero because he died. He was a hero because he made terrible jokes to keep us laughing, because he shared his chocolate rations with local kids, because he cried when he thought nobody was looking after we lost our first man. The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense that something profound was happening, something that demanded their attention and respect. Security personnel had stopped their approach, uncertain how to handle a situation that had evolved far beyond their standard protocols. What's his name? Thomas asked, nodding toward the medal in James's hands. The one you can't stop thinking about. Tell me about him. James felt tears building behind his eyes. Ahmed Hassan. He was our translator for 3 years. Spoke 5 languages, had a degree in engineering from Baghdad University. He could have left Iraq, gotten a visa, started over somewhere safe, but he stayed because he believed we were trying to help. What happened to him? Sniper got him while he was helping evacuate civilians from a market bombing. I was supposed to be covering that sector, but I got pulled away to deal with casualties from the explosion. If I had been there, if I had stayed at my post. James's voice broke completely. If you had been there, you would have died too, Thomas said firmly. And Ahmed would have died anyway, and those civilians you saved instead would be dead as well. You think he would want you to destroy your life over a decision that saved other people? James stared at the medal in his hands. For 20 years, it had felt like a weight around his neck, a constant reminder of inadequacy and survivor's guilt. But listening to Thomas speak about Danny Mills, hearing the pain and love and desperate need to honor the dead properly, James began to see his situation differently. The worst part, James whispered, is that I can't remember his laugh anymore. Ahmed had this incredible laugh like music, but I've replayed his death so many times that it's drowning out everything else. I'm losing the good memories. Thomas nodded slowly. Danny used to sing off-key Beatles songs when he was nervous. Drove us all crazy, but now I'd give anything to hear Yellow Submarine sung badly one more time. The trauma wants to eat the good memories. You have to fight for them. Something shifted in the crowd. The initial confusion and discomfort had transformed into something deeper, more respectful. People weren't just watching a spectacle anymore. They were witnessing 2 soldiers helping each other carry burdens that had grown too heavy for one person alone. James looked at the medal again, but this time he tried to remember Ahmed's laugh instead of his death. For just a moment he could almost hear it, faint but genuine, cutting through 20 years of nightmares. What do I do with this? James asked, holding up the medal. I can't throw it away anymore, but I can't keep carrying it the way I have been. Thomas smiled slightly, the first real expression he had allowed himself since taking his position that morning. You carry it differently. You carry it for him, not because of him. You carry it because Ahmed Hassan deserved to be remembered by someone who knew his laugh, not just his death. The 2 men stood facing each other across the barrier, each carrying decades of pain and guilt, but no longer carrying them alone. Neither of them realized that their conversation was being recorded by dozens of phones, or that their moment of connection would soon reach millions of people around the world. All they knew was that, for the first time in years, the weight felt manageable. The silence stretched between Thomas and James, heavy with shared understanding and the weight of memories finally given voice. Around them, the crowd had become something different than it had been moments before. No longer mere tourists seeking entertainment, they had become witnesses to something profound and deeply human. Thomas knew he should return to his position. Every moment he remained out of formation was a breach of protocol that could end his career. His commanding officers would be reviewing security footage within hours, and questions would be asked that he wasn't sure he could answer satisfactorily. But looking at James, Seeing the way the older veteran's shoulders had begun to relax for the first time since Thomas had been watching him, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "I have to ask you something," James said, his voice steadier now. "How do you do it? How do you stand here every day, representing everything we were told to believe in when you know what the cost really is?" It was a question Thomas had wrestled with for months when he first joined the Queen's Guard. After Iraq, after losing Danny and 3 other close friends, the pageantry and ceremony had felt hollow, almost insulting. Standing here in his red uniform and tall hat, performing for tourists who saw military service as something romantic and glorious, had seemed like the ultimate betrayal of his fallen comrades. "At first I couldn't," Thomas admitted. "I spent my first 6 months here angry at everything. Angry at the tourists taking pictures, angry at the children waving flags, angry at myself for being part of what felt like a lie. I thought about requesting a transfer dozens of times. What changed?" Thomas glanced back at his fellow guards who were maintaining their positions, but clearly straining to hear every word. He thought about Sergeant Williams, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and now stood stoically despite having lost his left leg below the knee to an IED. He thought about Private Morrison, barely 21, whose father had died in the Falklands before Morrison was born. "I realize that we're not here to celebrate war," Thomas said. "We're here to remember the cost of peace. Every tourist who takes a picture, every child who waves a flag, they're celebrating the fact that they can do those things safely. That's what Danny died for. Not for glory or medals, but so some kid from Germany can take selfies in London without worrying about car bombs." James felt something crack inside his chest, but this time it wasn't painful. It was like ice breaking in spring, making room for something new to grow. "I never thought about it that way. The uniform isn't about us," Thomas continued. "It's about them, and it's about the ones who can't wear uniforms anymore. I stand here for Danny, and for Sergeant Carter, and for everyone else who should have made it home. I stand here because they can't, and because the world needs to see that freedom isn't free." A young girl in the crowd, maybe 6 years old, had been listening intently despite not understanding all the words. She tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered something. The man looked uncomfortable but nodded, lifting her up and walking closer to where James stood. "Excuse me, sir," the man said nervously. "My daughter wanted to say something." James looked at the child, whose serious brown eyes reminded him painfully of his own daughter Emma. The girl studied his face for a moment, then said in a clear, innocent voice, "My daddy says you're sad because your friends got hurt in the war." "I'm sorry your friends got hurt." The simple sincerity of her words nearly broke James completely. This child didn't understand military strategy or geopolitics or the complex reasons men go to war. She only understood that someone was in pain, and she wanted to acknowledge that pain. It was exactly the kind of response Ahmed would have loved, exactly the sort of genuine human connection he had risked his life to protect. "Thank you," James managed to say. "That means more than you know." Thomas watched this exchange and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, pride in his uniform and what it represented. Not pride in war or violence, but pride in the idea that his service, his sacrifice, his friends' deaths had helped create a world where a child could approach a stranger with compassion rather than fear. The girl's father set her down, and she reached into her small backpack, pulling out a worn teddy bear. "Mr. Buttons helps me when I'm sad," she said, offering the bear to James. "Maybe he can help you too." James knelt down to the child's level, accepting the teddy bear with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "Mr. Buttons looks very wise," he said seriously. "I think he and I could be good friends." The girl beamed and skipped back to her family, leaving James holding a stuffed animal that somehow felt more meaningful than any medal ever had. Around them, other people in the crowd began to step forward. An elderly woman approached with a thermos of tea. A teenager offered his jacket when he noticed James shivering. A businessman handed him a card for a veterans support group. Thomas realized that something remarkable was happening. The crowd wasn't just witnessing their conversation anymore. They were becoming part of it. The barriers between soldier and civilian, between protector and protected, were dissolving as people recognized their shared humanity. "You know what I think Ahmed would tell you if he could?" Thomas asked, watching James clutch the teddy bear like a lifeline. "What?" "I think he'd tell you to stop carrying his death and start carrying his life. Stop remembering only the last moment, and start remembering all the moments that made him worth knowing. Stop punishing yourself for surviving and start honoring him by living." James looked down at the military cross still clutched in his other hand. The bronze no longer felt like it was burning his fingers. It felt like what it had always been, a symbol of a moment when he had chosen to act rather than freeze, to save lives rather than save himself. The medal wasn't the problem. The problem was that he had been carrying it wrong, focusing on what it cost rather than what it represented. "I don't know how to do that," James admitted. "I don't know how to live with this." "None of us do," Thomas replied. "That's why we have to help each other figure it out. That's why we have to stop pretending we're fine and start admitting we're all just trying to make sense of senseless things." For the first time in 20 years, James felt like he wasn't alone with his pain. Standing here in front of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by strangers who had become something like family, holding a child's teddy bear while a fellow soldier offered him understanding instead of judgment, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. The changing of the guard ceremony had been delayed indefinitely, but nobody in the crowd seemed to mind. They were witnessing something more important than military pageantry. They were watching two broken men help each other begin to heal, and in that healing, they were finding something that connected them all. The moment of connection between Thomas and James stretched into something larger than either man had anticipated. Word of the unprecedented scene was spreading beyond the immediate crowd, as videos taken on phones began appearing on social media. Within an hour, clips of a Queen's Guard breaking protocol to counsel a traumatized veteran were being shared across the world. Major Harrison, commanding officer of the Guard unit, arrived at the scene with barely contained urgency. He had been monitoring reports from the palace security team, and what he was hearing seemed impossible. One of his men had abandoned his post, engaged with a potentially unstable civilian, and turned a routine ceremony into an international incident. But as Harrison pushed through the crowd, what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Instead of chaos or confrontation, he found something that looked almost like a community gathering. James was sitting on a nearby bench still holding the child's teddy bear, surrounded by people who were sharing their own stories. A middle-aged man was talking about his brother who had died in Northern Ireland. A young woman was describing her struggles with anxiety after serving as a military nurse in Syria. Thomas remained near the palace gates, technically still on duty, but clearly part of something much larger than his assigned role. When he spotted Major Harrison approaching, Thomas straightened slightly but didn't return to his post. "Right," Harrison said quietly, his voice carrying a warning. "You know this is going to require a full investigation. Breaking formation, engaging with civilians during an active ceremony, creating a public disturbance. Your career could be over." Thomas met his commanding officer's eyes steadily. "Yes, sir. I understand that. Then why did you do it?" Thomas looked back at James, who was now in deep conversation with the businessman who had offered him the support group card. The older veteran's face had color in it for the first time since Thomas had been watching him, and his hands were steady as he gestured while speaking. "Because he was about to throw away his military cross, sir, not out of disrespect but out of despair. And I couldn't stand by and watch another soldier destroy himself when I might be able to help." Harrison followed Thomas's gaze to James. As a career military officer, he recognized the signs immediately: the posture, the haunted eyes, the careful way the man held himself as if his body contained too much pain for one person to bear. Harrison had seen too many good soldiers destroyed by survivors' guilt and inadequate support systems. "You realize this is all over the internet?" Harrison asked. "Videos of you counseling that man are being shared by thousands of people. The palace is fielding calls from news organizations around the world. Is that bad, sir?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his own father, who had served in the Falklands and never spoke about what he had seen there. He thought about the suicide rates among veterans, the inadequate mental health resources, the way society celebrated military service in parades and ceremonies while ignoring the human cost of that service. "I don't know yet," Harrison admitted, "but I know that man was prepared to throw away a military cross, and now he's talking about starting a support group for combat veterans. Something changed here today." In the crowd, a journalist from the BBC had arrived and was conducting impromptu interviews. Sarah Chen, a reporter who had covered military affairs for over a decade, approached James with the respectful caution of someone who understood trauma. "Sir, I'm Sarah Chen with the BBC. I've been following this story as it's developed online. Would you be willing to talk about what happened here today?" James looked up from his conversation with the businessman, startled by the sudden media attention. His first instinct was to decline, to retreat back into the privacy that had protected him for so long. But then he looked at Thomas, still standing at attention but watching him with encouraging eyes. "I suppose," James said slowly, "though I'm not sure why anyone would want to hear what I have to say." "Because you're not the only one," Sarah replied gently. "The videos of what happened here are resonating with people around the world. Veterans, families of veterans, people who have never served but recognize pain when they see it. You started something today that's bigger than just you and that guard." James glanced at the teddy bear in his hands, then at the military cross, which he had carefully placed back in its wooden box. "What kind of something?" A conversation that should have been happening for years. About what we really ask of our soldiers and what we owe them when they come home. About the difference between honoring service and actually supporting the people who serve. Thomas, overhearing this exchange, felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. He had acted on instinct, responding to a fellow soldier in crisis. But he was beginning to understand that his decision would have consequences, far beyond this single afternoon. Major Harrison approached. The small group that had formed around James. "Mr. Mitchell," he said formally, having learned the veteran's name from the security briefing. "I'm Major Harrison, commanding officer here. I wanted to personally thank you for your service, and to apologize if any of our protocols made your situation more difficult today." James stood up, unconsciously straightening into a more military bearing. "No apology necessary, sir. Your man there," he nodded toward Thomas. "He probably saved my life today. I was in a very dark place when I came here." "Guard Wright broke significant protocol to help you," Harrison said carefully. "Ordinarily, that would result in disciplinary action. But these aren't ordinary circumstances, are they?" "No, sir, they're not," James replied. "And I hope you won't punish him for showing more courage in 10 minutes than I've managed in 20 years. The crowd around them had grown larger, but it remained respectful and quiet. People seemed to understand that they were witnessing something important, something that deserved their attention rather than their interference. Sarah Chen was taking notes rapidly, already crafting the story that would run on that evening's news. This wasn't just a human interest piece about a guard helping a veteran. This was a story about institutional failure and individual heroism, about the gap between how society talks about military service and how it actually supports the people who serve. "What happens now?" James asked, looking between Thomas and Major Harrison. I came here to throw away my medal and probably do something stupid afterward. Now I'm talking to reporters and thinking about starting support groups. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that." Thomas smiled slightly. "Same thing I'm going to do, I expect. Try to figure out how to help other people carry what we've all been carrying alone. Even if it costs you your career. Especially if it cost me my career," Thomas replied. "Because what's the point of protecting institutions that don't protect the people they're supposed to serve?" Major Harrison listened to this exchange with growing understanding. The situation was unprecedented, but so was the response it was generating. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from superiors, but it had also been buzzing with messages from veterans organizations, mental health advocates, and military families expressing support for what had happened here. "Right," he said finally. "You're relieved of duty for today. Report to my office tomorrow morning for a full debriefing. We'll figure out what comes next." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. Then with a slight grin he added, "Should I bring my resignation letter?" "Let's see what the world looks like tomorrow before we make any irreversible decisions," Harrison said. "Something tells me this story isn't over yet." 6 months after that extraordinary day at Buckingham Palace, James Mitchell stood in a community center in East London, watching 30 veterans and their families fill the room for the weekly meeting of what had become known as the Ahmed Hassan Support Circle. The teddy bear that a little girl had given him still sat on the registration table, now serving as an unofficial mascot for their group. The video of Thomas breaking protocol to help James had been viewed over 10 million times across various platforms. More importantly, it had sparked a national conversation about veteran mental health that resulted in increased funding for support programs, policy changes in the military, and a cultural shift in how society talked about the cost of service. Thomas entered the room in civilian clothes, having resigned from the Queen's Guard 3 months earlier. The resignation hadn't been forced. In fact, after the initial investigation, He had been quietly commended by higher-ups who recognized that his actions had done more for military public relations than years of traditional ceremony. But Thomas had realized that his calling lay elsewhere. "How are we looking tonight?" Thomas asked, helping James arrange chairs in their customary circle. "Full house again," James replied. "And we have 3 new people. A Navy veteran from Portsmouth, a Royal Marine who just returned from deployment, and the wife of a soldier who's been struggling since he came back from Syria." The success of their support group had surprised everyone, including James and Thomas. What had started as an informal gathering of a few veterans sharing stories had grown into a registered charity with multiple locations across the UK. They had partnered with the NHS to provide professional counseling services, worked with employers to create veteran-friendly hiring programs, and lobbied Parliament for better mental health resources. But the real success wasn't measured in numbers or policy changes. It was measured in moments like the one James was experiencing now, as he watched Robert Chen, a 24-year-old Army veteran who had been nearly catatonic when he first arrived, laughing with new members as he helped them fill out information forms. Sarah Chen, the BBC reporter who had covered their original story, had become a regular attendee not as a journalist but as the sister of a veteran who had died by suicide 2 years earlier. She waved at James from across the room, where she was setting up the tea station that had become a beloved tradition. "Before we start tonight," James announced as people took their seats, "I want to share some news. Thomas and I received a letter from the Ministry of Defense yesterday." A hush fell over the group. Many of them had been following the bureaucratic battles that James and Thomas had been fighting to improve veteran services, and they knew that official communications could bring either triumph or disappointment. The Secretary of Defense has announced the creation of a new program called the Warriors Bridge Initiative, Thomas continued. It will provide immediate counseling services for all returning personnel, mandatory mental health check-ins for the first 2 years after service, and family support programs. The room erupted in applause, but James raised his hand for quiet. More than that, they're implementing what they're calling the Ahmed Hassan Protocol, named after my friend who died in Afghanistan. Every veteran will have access to a peer support network modeled on what we've built here. Margaret Wilson, a Royal Navy veteran in her 50s, wiped tears from her eyes. "It's about time," she said. "How many of us could have been saved if something like this had existed when we came home?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Everyone in the room had lost someone to suicide, addiction, or the slower death of complete isolation. But instead of dwelling on regret, they had learned to focus on prevention. "Speaking of saving people," Thomas said, "James has something else to share." James felt his cheeks redden slightly. Personal announcements always made him uncomfortable, but this group had become his family and they deserved to know. "Sarah and I are talking again," he said quietly. "She called after seeing the BBC documentary about our work here. She wants to try to rebuild what we had, slowly and with proper support this time." The group's response was immediate and warm. These people understood better than anyone how trauma could destroy relationships, and they also understood how healing could rebuild them. Sarah had initially left not because she stopped loving James, but because she didn't know how to help him, and watching him suffer was destroying her too. "The kids want to visit next weekend," James continued. "Emma and David have been asking about the support group. I think they're proud of what we're doing here." Robert Chen raised his hand. "Can I say something?" When James nodded, the young veteran stood up. 6 months ago, I came here because my mate dragged me. I hadn't spoken to anyone outside my flat in 3 weeks. I was planning to kill myself the next Tuesday had it all worked out." The room was completely silent. Even though they had heard similar stories dozens of times, each one carried its own weight, its own importance. "I'm still here because of what happens in this room every week," Robert continued. "Not because anyone preached at me or told me to get over it, but because I finally understood I wasn't alone with this stuff. And because James and Thomas showed me that you can carry the weight of what you've seen without letting it crush you." Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever someone shared their story. He still carried Danny Mills with him every day, but now he carried him differently. Instead of guilt and regret, he carried love and purpose. Danny's death had meaning because it inspired Thomas to prevent other deaths, to help other soldiers find their way home, not just physically, but emotionally. As the formal meeting began and people shared their struggles and victories from the week, James looked around the circle and felt something he had never expected to experience again: genuine happiness. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Not the erasure of trauma, but the transformation of trauma into something useful. The military cross now sat in a place of honor in his living room, not hidden away in shame, but displayed alongside photographs of Ahmed Hassan and letters from veterans whose lives had been changed by their work. The medal no longer represented his failure to save everyone. It represented his commitment to save whoever he could. After the meeting ended and the last person had left, James and Thomas sat in the empty community center, completing their usual post-meeting debriefing. The teddy bear sat between them on the table, as worn now as it had been 6 months ago, but somehow more valuable for all the hands that had held it. "You know what Ahmed would think of all this?" James asked, gesturing around the room with its inspirational posters and resource tables. "What?" He'd laugh that incredible laugh of his and say we took the long way around to figuring out something simple. "Which is what?" James picked up the teddy bear and smiled. "That the best way to honor the dead is to take care of the living. That the best way to carry what we've lost is to share the weight with people who understand. That healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means remembering better." Thomas nodded, thinking of Danny Mills and his off-key Beatles songs. Somewhere in the distance he could almost hear Yellow Submarine being sung badly. And for the first time in years the sound made him smile instead of cry. Outside the community center, London continued its evening rhythm, unaware that in this small room, 2 broken soldiers had discovered that the best way to save themselves was to save each other, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is simply refuse to suffer alone.